since, and so I thought I would kill two birds with one stone, go live today, and then put the video out as a video later on so people can catch up. I've actually had a few requests for more stories, so hope you enjoy this one. As I said, the book is quite a well-known book in the narrowboat community. It is called simply Narrowboat by L.T.C Rolt, written in the 1940s, before before recreational narrowboating really was a thing. And it's just a lovely gentle read, and if you're watching this later and looking to be whispered to sleep, maybe you're even watching it now wanting to be whispered to sleep, then I hope you enjoy. I've already done one video. You'll find it on my playlist. I've read the foreword and chapter 1 as a video, and we'll see how far we go today. But I'm going to start the live today on chapter 2. Let's see what the chapter is called. I bought this book secondhand, and this little card came in it, and I use it as the bookmark. Yeah. Chapter 2 is called To Banbury Cross. It was a sunny, boisterous day, and my road lay over the northern Cotswolds. Most motorists chose the tarmac highway, which scorns the villages and cuts straight across the bare uplands through Stow-on-the-Wold and Chipping Norton. This is the route indicated by those motoring maps, which depict the face of England covered by a network of thick red lines, as ugly as the roads themselves. They are a useful diagram of roads to be avoided, but that is all. My guide has always been the inch to the mile Ordnance Survey map, which is a mine of information about the country, and the unfailing philosopher and friend of the true traveller. The route I had chosen took me straight and steeply onto the hills above Winchcombe by way of Sudley, and from their lofty summit the old town appeared as a small cluster of smoke-shrouded grey roofs sheltering under the great shoulders of Langley and Cleeve Common. This brought me to the old hill road to Camden, which follows the majestic, wave-like lift and fall of the Wolds by Linsbarn and Stump's Cross. It was the turn of the year, and although the wind which swept across these great uplands had not yet lost its winter keenness, the sun shone with a brave Shipston-on-Stour, 7 miles on, is built of that rose red brick, which is so much in harmony with the softer landscapes of the Vale. The villages of Upper and Lower Braille, though under the shadow of the hills, are also of brick, but journey a little further, and the thatched cottages of Swalcliffe, Tadmorton, and Brufton are all built of the tawny Edgehill limestone. After such a journey, the outskirts of Banbury were a sorry sight, for the sturdy stone heart of this old market town by the Cherwell is besieged on all sides by semi-detached monstrosities whose growth has recently received fresh impetus from new industrial expansion. Doubtless it is for this reason that Banbury has received scant treatment from such authors as have visited her in search of the picturesque. For as long ago as 1911, one wrote, "There is little of the old aspect of Banbury left now, yet the worth and the character of places cannot always be accurately judged by first impressions. The beautiful show village, on deeper investigation, often turns out to be as lifeless as a stuffed bird in a museum. The cottages, weekend dormitories for jaded businessmen, and the great barns, riding schools, or roadhouses, all for the eye. As an old Gloucestershire farmer I know once said of them, and nothing for the belly. On the other hand, towns and villages which have a more workaday appearance often conceal beneath an exterior that may seem positively drab a character and charm which are no less than the old vigorous life of the place. This was what I discovered in Banbury during my 3-month stay. Had I only stayed as many weeks, I might have missed it. The Oxford Canal is typically secretive in its passage through the town, and although there is a large wharf which handles a substantial trade in coal, a stranger would have difficulty in finding any trace of it. Even some of the inhabitants of Banbury seem to be unaware of its existence, as I discovered later when my statement that I was living on a boat was accepted by local tradesmen as a sally of Munchausen humour. I do not blame them, for I paid several visits to the boatyard where Cressy was moored before I became certain of finding my way without error. It lay down an extremely almost illegible with age, and the best clue to its identity was a sign over a small shop on the corner which proclaimed tripe, ox heels, and neatsfoot oil for sale. The street ended at a wooden drawbridge over the canal, to the left of which was the boatyard where Cressy lay between two derelict narrowboats. When I had shipped my belongings aboard, I hurried back into the town to obtain the additional stores I needed before the shops closed. A loaf of bread and a pint of milk, sausages for supper, and bacon for breakfast, paraffin for the lamps, and a sack of coke from the gasworks for the saloon stove, since the nights were still cold. On the opposite side of the drawbridge from the boatyard there was a lock, and on the lock side stood a toll office. There all the boats southward bound for Oxford with their cargoes of coal were checked and gauged. At 8 o'clock every weekday evening, the toll clerk locked the bridge in the closed position and swung a heavy door across the towing path, so that any latecomers had to tie up until the following morning. There can be no mistaking this hour of closing, for they still ring the curfew in Banbury. I heard the measured tolling of the bell very distinctly that evening as I was cooking my first meal in the galley, for the wind had fallen with the going down of the sun, and the air was still and very clear. It struck me as singularly appropriate that on this lane of still water, which was like a road that had fallen asleep, it should be this tranquil, ancient voice of the town, and not the roar of traffic, that I should hear. I had selected the most promising of an elderly and rather dubious assortment of lilo mattresses, and was making my bed when the creak of tackle and the slow clip-clop of hooves on the towing path opposite heralded the arrival of a belated horseboat. I looked out. The boatman was walking beside his horse, and when they drew abreast of my window, they halted. Dim shapes in the darkness. The tow line fell slack as the boat, low laden in the water, slid into view, and the scarcely perceptible ripples round her bluff bows died as she was checked and drawn into the side. Golden lamplight streaming from the open aft doors of the cabin illuminated the weather-beaten face of the woman, at the tiller, and glinted on her gold earrings. These were my unknown neighbours on my first night afloat, though they must have cast away soon after sunrise. They did not disturb me, for I slept soundly, despite the fact that the mattress I had so laboriously blown up deflated overnight, so that I awoke to find myself on the hard boards. Chapter 3. The Boat Builders. By the way, if you're just joining, I'm reading the book Narrowboat by L.T.C Rolt. When I awoke, the sunlight, reflected by the breeze-ruffled water, was weaving patterns of shifting light on the cabin roof, and from without came sounds of manifold activity. There was a clinking of hammer on anvil, the creak and sigh of forge bellows, and the clatter of caulking mullets, while a lusty male voice was singing Bonnie Mary. Presumably, this songster was the blacksmith, for occasionally there came a stamping of hooves, and the song would be interrupted by shouts of "Whoa!" or "Hold up, will you?" I looked out to see 2 cart horses outside the door of the smithy, awaiting their turn to be shod, and men at work on the narrow boat in the dry dock. The Banbury boatyard was a typical example of the small, skilled family business which is having such a bitter struggle for existence in these days when the demand is for quantity and not quality. This demand expects extended credit and cut prices, 2 conditions which the craftsman cannot fulfill, since he lacks the necessary capital reserve and is unwilling and unable to compete against the inferior mass-produced article. Old Mr. Tooley had been a boatman like his father until he went into the boat-building business many years ago. He was a little bent old man with drooping white moustaches and a most engaging smile that sent fans of wrinkles spreading from the corners of his remarkably bright eyes. He wore a battered bowler hat whose austere black had mellowed with age to a rusty brown, and the combination was so inseparable that the eye soon grew to accept the ancient headgear as a natural part of the man. He was getting too old for heavy work, and, as he himself admitted, he couldn't get his breath like he used. But next door who, although nearly blind, still pottered down to the forge to blow the fire for his son. Mr. Dooley could not leave the scene of his life's work. It was gratifying indeed to find that his two sons were carrying on their father's craft. Time was when they built the long wooden boats at Dooley's yard, but now, owing to the decline of canal traffic and the introduction of the steel boat, their work was confined to repairs. The average wooden narrowboat requires docking about once every 3 years, so that this work was spasmodic, and despite the fact that the family were prepared to tackle any job in the way of joinery or wheelwrighting that would tide them over, there were times when the yard fell slack. Because of this, George, the elder son, had been forced to take a job at the new factory on the outskirts of the town. This is a typical instance of the way in which the craftsman is being compelled to forfeit the birthright of his hereditary craft and lose himself in the modern industrial system, where the skill of hands is subordinate to the rapidity of the machine. Perhaps one day we shall awaken from the spell of the machine and realize how much natural art and skill we have lost in this sorry process. One of the most damaging effects of modern mechanized industry is the intensive specialization it involves. The so-called skilled operative acquires such a mechanical dexterity by performing a single repetition job that he becomes as helpless as a raw apprentice when confronted with a strange task, or if he is deprived of his costly jigs and tools. Your true craftsman, on the other hand, is infinitely versatile because he relies primarily upon the hand and the eye, the finest and most adaptable tools in the world. The Dooley family demonstrated this versatility in the way they had adapted themselves to meet changing conditions by acquiring a considerable mechanical skill which was entirely self-taught. When the crude oil engine began to supersede the horse on the Oxford Canal, they fitted several motors in horse boats with great success. They installed their own generating plant to light the workshop and charge the boatmen's wireless batteries. Most remarkable of all, when this engine broke a piston, they did not, as you would suppose, send an urgent order to the manufacturer for a spare, but set to work to make another. This meant making a wooden pattern everyday occurrence, and the engine has run perfectly ever since. Nevertheless, it was their work of repairing and furbishing the wooden boats that most delighted me, for it was no less than the last miraculous survival of a craft centuries old. In the 13th century, Sainte-Chapelle of Pierre de Montereau in Paris, there is a carving upon a door which represents the building of the Ark. 3 medieval boat builders are at work. One is swinging his mallet as he caulks the seams between the timbers, which a second is tarring from a pot with the aid of a long-handled brush. A third, standing inside the hull, is using the adze. I saw these tools used in precisely the same manner at Tooley's yard. The adze had become almost extinct among the tools of the country carpenter, who once used it extensively for squaring beams and roof timbers. But among canal boat builders, this rural bygone still survives. The seams of the narrow boats are caulked with strands of oakum, and the noise of the mallets, which I heard so often, was that same sound which must have echoed through the woods by Bolio River when they were building the Agamemnon and the Eurolus on the slips of Buckler's Hard. The tall rudder post of the canal boat suggests an association even older, for the boatmen call it a ram's head, and so recall the carved fighting ships of the Norsemen. On the inside of the hull, the timbers are plastered with hot calico, a time-honoured mixture of tar, cow hair, and horse dung. Then a layer of felt or brown paper is applied, and finally the thin vertical oak planks or shearing are nailed into position. Sometimes the main timbers or strakes at the bow or stern have to be renewed. These have a double curvature to conform to the graceful inward and upward sweep of the hull. A single curve can be obtained by the conventional method of steaming, but it was explained to me that if both curves were obtained by this method in a piece of straight-grained oak, it would sooner or later crack and split. The craftsman's solution is to obtain a timber having one correct curve already in the grain, so that it need be bent only in one direction. Mr. Tooley must have carried this natural curve in his mind's eye, for he related how, years ago, he had spotted a suitable oak bought it. Now it lay in the yard, sawn into timbers, ready for use, and I can think of no better fate that could befall an English oak. When the heavier jobs on the hull have been completed, the boat builder's next task is the redecoration, and I was lucky enough to see this work carried out on the boat Florence, which was on the dock at the time of my arrival. Each member of the family played his especial part. George began in his spare time from the factory. He was the lettering expert and painted the owner's name and port of origin in elaborate cream lettering shaded with blue on the large vermilion centre panel of the cabin side. Then it was the old man's turn to embellish his son's work with little garlands of bright flowers in the four corners and between the lettering. Finally, it was left to Herbert, the younger son, to paint his castles on the four small side panels. Apart from striking a line with a chalked string to keep the lettering level, they did no preliminary sketching or spacing out whatever, but worked straight out of their heads with wonderful rapidity and skill. I watched fascinated while Herbert painted the four castles in the space of one afternoon, dipping first into one and then another of the small tins of oil paint of his own grinding and mixing. He blended together the green, the blue, and the sepia until a typical scene dear to generations of canal folk suddenly took shape under his hand. Here it would be a castle with a single battlemented turret rising against a background of rolling blue hills and red sunset. There, a more monastic structure, twin-towered and backed by woods, a stream flowing improbably through an arch in the base of one tower and spreading into a lake in the foreground. Each panel differed from its neighbour, yet all were true to that traditional form which appears so strangely foreign in its conception. Who first established this convention of tall stucco towers and wide-eaved red roofs? Perhaps it was some old wandering Romany who exchanged his caravan for a narrow boat when the canals were young, and adorned the walls of his new home with his memories of fairy tale castles in the Carpathians. Whatever the origin, its influence is still strong, for this was by no means the end of the decorative work. Castles were also painted which support the gangplanks, all had to be picked out with bright geometrical patterns of colour before the boatman's exacting eye was satisfied. When all the work had been accomplished and the Florence was floated out, her captain stood beside old Mr. Tooley on the deck side. After an unhurried critical scrutiny, "Well, George," he said, "I reckon she looks well." This remark, coming from a boatman, was high praise, and to my mind it was certainly well merited. A modern economist would have pointed out quite truthfully that she would have been just as serviceable had she been painted battleship grey throughout, at a great saving of labour. But because the men of the canals are not economists and have a standard of value which is not based upon paper money, the Florence bore a coat of many colours and lay resplendent in the morning sun. Each boat carries 2 water cans, one an open dipper which, as its name implies, is dipped into the canal and used for 101 domestic uses, from peeling potatoes to washing the captain's wool vest. The other is a tall can with handle, spout and lid, like a mammoth hot water jug, in which drinking water is stored. Both are elaborately decorated with flowers and often carry the owner's name in white letters on a red circumferential band. The boatmen brought these cans to Mr. Tooley when they needed a repaint, for the old man excelled at his work. To behold them, as I did when he sat before the bench in his narrow workshop, the battered bowler firmly planted at the back of his head, and a tray of many-coloured paints at his elbow, was to see the past miraculously living in the present. Not a past preserved in a museum or spuriously recreated in an arts and craft shop, but a vital tradition. Handling his fine camel hair brushes with wonderful sureness and delicacy, he first of all painted little shaded discs of sepia, ochre and pink on the green ground of the can, and surrounded them with a garland of pale green leaves. These were the centres of the roses. When they were dry, the petals, red on sepia, yellow on ochre, and white on pink, were superimposed so simply and swiftly that only in the way a mere blob of paint seemed suddenly to blossom forth was the skill revealed. The bright work was completed when the veining of the leaves had been painted in with a very fine brush and a coat of varnish applied to preserve it. Mr. Tooley was once asked by a London store to teach their employees how these flowers. I am glad that he refused, for his must surely be the only surviving natural art in this country which has not been commercially exploited and debased. I obtained a promise from him that when my own work on Cressy had reached the decorating stage, he would paint for me a bunch of roses on each of the 4 panels in the sleeping cabin. Later, I feared that he would never be able to keep this promise, for the old man was taken seriously ill with pneumonia and spent some time in the local hospital. When he was at length discharged, he was still far from well, but he had not forgotten and insisted upon painting them. The work tired him exceedingly. He rested frequently on the stool I provided for him, but his hand was still sure. He has painted no flowers since. Now, I do not envy the art collector his masterpieces of the past, for they, though great, are dead. These simple paintings are rarer because they still live. They are unique survivals of the days when beauty was implicit in the work of hands and was made manifest by those hands in an infinite variety of form and pattern, which transformed the simplest object that they wrought into a thing of inspiration and delight. At the end of this chapter there is a little footnote. It is with sorrow that I have to record the death of Mr. George Tooley soon after this book was written. Well, it was in the 1940s, 1944 this book was first published, and this is only chapter 2, or is it? No, chapter 3. Narrowboat by L.T.C Rolt, and I'm loving it just feels alive, the history of the times, and the fact that even in the 1940s this man was appreciating craftsmen and talking about the industrial